Tonight, wanted. Police looking for a man with a long and violent criminal history. Help is on the way. The Peace Region welcomes new sheriffs. And diverted. British Columbia's safe supply of drugs being sold on the black market. Good evening and thank you for joining us. And we begin tonight with RCMP in Fort St. John asking for the public's help in finding a man with a long and violent criminal history. Gavin Davis is currently wanted on a number of warrants, and they're part of a much longer criminal history dating back over a decade. Davis is being described as an Indigenous male standing 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighing 243 pounds. He has black hair and brown eyes and several distinctive tattoos. The charges against him include flight from police, dangerous operation of a vehicle, breach of release order, possession for trafficking, and firearm offenses. Police say he has connections to northern BC, the lower mainland, and northern Alberta. He's also known to carry firearms, according to authorities. Now, Davis has a long criminal history dating all the way back to 2008. He's previously been found guilty of assault, uttering threats, and breach of probation. Most recently, in August of last year, he was found guilty of breaching a release order. He was sentenced to 60 days in jail and 6 months probation. 2 months before that, he was found guilty of possessing a firearm without a license and given 56 days in jail. Now, RCMP are urging anyone who sees Davis not to approach him. Instead, you're being asked to immediately contact the nearest police detachment. Mounties continue to investigate and asking anyone with any information to come forward or submit an anonymous tip via Crime Stoppers. A graduating class of BC sheriffs will soon start their careers at courthouses in Fort St. John and Dawson Creek. Attorney General Nikki Sharma welcoming the 24 graduates at a ceremony. A total of 5 have been assigned to the north. There'll be 2 sheriffs added in Dawson Creek and 1 in Fort St. John. However, they will be moved across the region based on need. The sheriffs provide protection for those involved in the justice system, including the Crown, judges, defense lawyers, court staff, and the public. And they also take people who've been arrested or have been found guilty to and from jails or prisons. Their first day of duty is slated for March the 7th. An Indigenous Justice Center is set to open in Fort St. John. It's one of 6 new centers opening to fulfill a commitment to BC First Nations Council to establish 15 centers across the province. The centers address systemic barriers faced by Indigenous people in the justice system. They provide clients with legal representation, advice, and support at the community level, regardless of whether they qualify for legal aid. They primarily focus on criminal law and child protection issues. They also facilitate supports for housing, mental health, and addiction treatment, as well as employment services. The openings of the center fulfills a framework laid out in the first BC First Nations Justice Strategy. Finding by Stats Canada found Indigenous people are overrepresented in adult prisons. Despite being nearly 6% of BC's population, they represent 36% of provincial jail inmates. The first 9 centers opened last year and have assisted in more than 2,000 cases. The province designating $44 million towards the initiative last year. An official opening date for the center in Fort St. John is yet to be announced. Well, a significant portion of opioids prescribed by doctors and pharmacists across the province are being diverted, and that's allowing BC's safe supply of drugs to then be trafficked by drug dealers. That, according to a leaked Ministry of Health document. The briefing was made public by the BC Conservative Party. It says prescribed alternatives are being trafficked provincially across Canada and internationally. The Ministry of Health has been conducting an investigation into the alleged scheme. It involves incentives paid by dozens of BC pharmacies to patients, doctors, and housing providers. BC's health minister says she is disappointed that the document was leaked. Josie Osborne adds the BC Conservatives have potentially compromised the investigation. But Osborne adds there's absolutely no excuse for bad actors when it comes to pharmacists. One of BC's largest public sector unions is calling for a provincial Crown corporation to be scrapped. They want its mandate to be brought back under the full control of the provincial government. The BC Government and Service Employees Union calls Community Living BC a bloated organization. The BC GEU says it spends too much money on bureaucrats and executives and not enough on frontline staff. A recent coroner's inquest into the starvation death of a woman with Down syndrome in CLBC care heard repeatedly that caregivers are underfunded. Families supporting people with complex and high needs only receive $700 per month, while the total compensation for Community Living CEO and his 4 vice presidents was more than $1.4 million last year alone.
We believe this is a failed experiment. It was done 20 years ago, it was broken out, and since then, it's left basically an expensive and costly extra piece of administrative overhead that leaves parents and caregivers exhausted and with less support than they deserve and need.
The Crown Corporation employs 800 BCGEU workers and has an annual budget of $1.7 billion. Well, now to tragic news from the Fraser Valley. 2 men are dead after falling through the ice during a fishing trip. Police say the men were reported missing Tuesday night and they didn't return home from the ice fishing on Grace Lake north of Agassiz. Volunteers from several search and rescue groups were deployed. They found 2 bodies under the water. The RCMP's underwater recovery team pulled the bodies from the lake. Police say the tragedy is a stark reminder that icy conditions are constantly changing. 1 man is dead and 15 others are in custody after 3 recent border incursions in Alberta and Manitoba.
We have the partnerships, the technology, and the resources in place to respond to the border and stop illegal activity.
In one case, a man was sent to a secondary inspection site at a border crossing in Alberta Tuesday, but police say he kept driving. Mounties chased him and he used a tire deflation device to stop the vehicle. He then ran away on foot and later died after shooting himself. On Monday, 4 adults and 5 children were found crossing the same border on foot. And crossing the border into the U.S. could get more complicated with the potential for longer waits if Donald Trump's threatened tariffs come into effect. The executive order includes ending the $800 customs exemption for Canadian goods going into the United States. The exemption has meant a custom declaration is not necessary. If the executive order does go ahead, that could mean more paperwork for travelers with searches at the discretion of the U.S. customs agents.
Every traveler will likely be questioned and will need to declare anything they're bringing. So even if it's small, even if it's a small purchase, they will need to tell the customs official about it.
Personal use items packed in a traveler's bag will be exempt from any duties. A last-minute deal Monday paused the tariffs until March the 4th. Well, new data shows Canadians are not putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to buying local. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, 82% of consumers think that it is important for their dollar to stay local, but 90% spend more at big businesses than at independent retailers. The Voice of Small Business says more needs to be done to support independent retailers as the American tariffs loom.
CFIB has found that every time a dollar is spent at a local small business, about 66 cents of that dollar is recirculated into the local provincial economy. A large multinational will only recirculate about 11 cents of every dollar into a local community.
The Canadian Federation of Independent Business says online purchases like those made through Amazon only circulate around 8 cents into the local economy. The group is calling on all British Columbians to rally around local businesses as the future remains uncertain. Well, there are more delays and cancellations at airports in Edmonton and Calgary today. It's capping up a week of frustration for travelers. CTV's Jeremy Thompson tells us some passengers at Edmonton International were losing their patience.
Frustrated, beyond frustrated.
I'm holding it all in. I'll just leave it at that.
Red and orange highlights show a handful of flights delayed or canceled, including Donna Leslie's.
I have 11 altogether, and this is Noah.
She was supposed to be on a flight to visit her grandkids Tuesday night.
It was canceled till 8 o'clock this morning, and so I came here for 8 o'clock or 6 o'clock this morning to check in, and it's canceled again.
At least 15 flights in and out of Edmonton were canceled, along with more than 130 nationwide this week. The vast majority were WestJet flights.
They apologized. I just heard something about weather, and that's about it.
This was the WestJet backlog in Calgary.
We will not be rebooking. If you're unhappy, what we're doing here today is we are sending out vouchers if you qualify for them.
A spokesperson for the airline says WestJet is working to reaccommodate all disrupted guests as quickly as possible, but due to limited availability on WestJet flights or with alternate carriers, it may not be possible to reaccommodate all affected guests within the 48-hour time frame specified by the Air Passenger Protection Regulations.
Just recently, WestJet was fined to the tune of $150,000 by the Canadian Transportation Agency for a previous incident in 2024.
This advocate believes WestJet is violating some air passenger protections now. He says sometimes airlines pay fines rather than going through the complex process of rebooking hundreds of flights.
Unfortunately, because of how low the penalties being issued are, it is still more profitable for airlines to break the law in many cases.
WestJet is adding back flights as planes clear winter maintenance procedures. Some passengers won't be taking them.
I'm flying Air Canada from Winnipeg back home to Toronto when it's done, so hopefully that one goes okay.
Jeremy Thompson, CTV News, Edmonton.
Canada Post is eliminating dozens of management positions. The Crown Corporation is confirming nearly 50 managers have been laid off. It's all part of a corporate-wide restructuring. About half of the impacted staff were in Ottawa, while others in Toronto and across the country. Last month, Canada Post restructured by cutting 20% of its senior executive jobs. Officials say the layoffs will not impact service to Canadians. Meantime, there's a growing push to remove trade barriers within Canada. It's something the premiers and prime minister discussed in their virtual meeting. The barriers take the form of regulations, and those regulations apply to multiple industries, services, and the ability of professionals to work in different provinces. The wine industry says it's much harder and more expensive to sell its product within Canada than to the United States. They say that needs to change.
We have different taxation systems, different markup systems, different rules around storing alcohol, importing alcohol. It's time to look at reducing all those barriers.
Those are exactly the kind of barriers that we have to work harder to pull down those differences across provinces so that everyone's on a fair playing field and we can sell our good BC wine somewhere else.
Trucking regulations are just another example of the impact of rules in different provinces. Estimates peg the additional transport cost caused by different provincial regulations at about 8% more. That's an additional cost that affects many goods in Canada. South of the border, transgender athletes say an executive order signed by Donald Trump is just another attack on their rights.
They're trying to save this fear because, let's face it, Donald Trump knows he's lying about transgender Americans.
The order bans transgender girls and women from competing in female sports. President Trump calls it a move to restore fairness, but the NCAA says it knows of fewer than 10 transgender athletes out of more than 500,000 college and university competitors. President Trump is going further. He's ordering Homeland Security to deny visas to transgender Olympic athletes. The province of Alberta moved to ban trans women in female sports divisions last year. And Prince Harry could be forced to leave the United States over issues with his visa. The slow-moving court case centers on the circumstances under which Harry entered the United States. Harry and his wife Meghan Markle moved to Southern California in 2020, but the Heritage Foundation is suing to see if he lied on his application, including about his past drug use. A judge is now considering whether or not to release Harry's records. All right, stay tuned. I'll be right back with a look at weather, but as we head to break, here's a look at today's closing market numbers.